Welcome to the Rugby Obsession Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
So imagine being the absolute star of your team. You know, you're universally respected, tipped to be the future captain of literally one of the most prestigious sporting organizations on the planet.
The dream scenario.
Right. But then, over the course of just a few short weeks, you're not only benched, you are completely ghosted by your boss.
It's a brutal shift.
Oh, absolutely. Today, we're unpacking a really phenomenal case study in sports management, communication, and, well, team dynamics.
Yeah, we're diving into some incredibly detailed reporting from Planet Rugby and the New Zealand Herald today.
And I just want to say right up front, we are so lucky as fans to get this level of transparent, behind-the-scenes access to elite sports culture. It's rare.
Very rare. It really lets us see how a high-performance environment actually operates when the pressure is, at its absolute peak.
Exactly. So to make sure you never miss out on these kinds of in-depth analyses, hit subscribe to Rugby Obsession right now. We've got a lot of ground to cover.
So we are looking at the departure of the 36 test cap Blues flanker, Dalton Papali'i. He's heading to the French top 14 club Castres.
Yeah.
But his exit to Europe is really just the focal point here. His situation essentially became the cause célèbre that exposed a massive communication breakdown during former head coach Scott Robertson's tenure with the All Blacks.
Yeah, so let's track the timeline of this breakdown, because Papali'i didn't just fade away organically, right?
No. Yeah.
Entering the 2024 season, which was, the highly anticipated start of the Scott Robertson era, Papali'i was the absolute first-choice open-side flanker.
Right. He was essentially a foundational piece of the puzzle. And, the weight of being tipped as a future All Blacks captain, that cannot be overstated.
Oh, massive pressure.
Exactly. In New Zealand, that leadership role requires not just, immense physical capability, but a really deep, unshakable trust from both the players and the management. So to go from that level of internal prestige to being entirely relegated from the Matchday 23 midway through the Rugby Championship, it's a staggering drop in status.
And that transition from the core group to the absolute outer limits is really where the structural crack started to show. There's this very public, very confusing situation regarding a hamstring injury.
Right, that hamstring.
Robertson was out there telling the media that he fully expected Papali'i to join the end-of-year tour. So, the fans expect it, the media writes about it.
But the actual call-up just never arrives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. In the past, we might use a corporate analogy here, like a CEO promising an MVP employee a spot on a big project, but the calendar invite never comes.
Sure.
But in elite sports, it's actually more visceral than that. Think of a high-performance team like a central nervous system. The head coach is the brain, the players are the muscle.
I like that.
When the brain sends out public signals saying the muscle is healthy and ready to fire, but the actual internal neural pathways are completely silent, you don't just get confusion.
No, the muscle eventually just atrophies.
Yeah.
It disconnects entirely.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is the concept of needlessness, which the sources highlight, and it perfectly encapsulates this entire saga. Clear communication is the absolute bedrock of a high-performance environment.
Because the margins are just so tight.
Right. The physical margins between winning and losing are incredibly thin. We aren't talking about a lack of athletic skill here. We are talking about a toxic vacuum of trust.
Wow. Yeah.
Elite athletes are profoundly pragmatic. They can handle being dropped if they're genuinely beaten out by someone in better form.
Sure, they get that.
But what shatters their foundation is the dissonance between what the head coach is projecting into a microphone and the sheer silence they are experiencing behind closed doors. It just breeds an uncontrollable culture of paranoia.
And that toxic vacuum is exactly why management realized they had to step in and stop the bleeding. They needed a reset. So they offered what was essentially an olive branch.
Right, the France game.
Yeah, Papali'i was selected for the final test against France last year.
And that selection was intended to be the path back to normalcy. And following that game in France, this critical conversation took place regarding the upcoming Rugby Championship squad traveling to Argentina.
Okay, yes.
This single, seemingly routine conversation is the pivot point where the entire relationship permanently derails, because it basically resulted in two completely divergent realities.
Okay, so on one side, you have the perspective of New Zealand Rugby and Scott Robertson. Robertson believed he was crystal clear during this chat. He said the call-up to go to Argentina was explicitly contingent on whether other players recovered from their injuries.
Right.
It was a conditional offer dependent on medical clearances.
But Papali'i walked away from that exact same conversation feeling 99% certain he was getting on that plane to Argentina.
Oh, man.
He fully believes his spot was secured. And the really devastating part of this timeline is that he received absolutely no further communication when the squad was officially named.
Just crickets.
Exactly. His name was glaringly absent from the roster, and nobody called him.
Okay, before we dive into the psychological mechanics of how that conversation went so horribly wrong, let me just pause to remind you, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden dynamics of elite rugby, hit that subscribe button for Rugby Obsession. We love having you with us as we untangle these complex stories.
Definitely.
Now, I want to push back on this Argentina misunderstanding for a second. Could this simply be a case of a player hearing what he desperately wants to hear?
It's possible.
We see this in high-stress performance reviews in the business world all the time. It's classic confirmation bias. A boss says, "You'll get the promotion if these 3 external things happen," and the employee only hears, "You'll get the promotion."
Right? Happy years.
Yeah. Is it possible Papali'i just had happy ears, and this isn't necessarily a systemic failure of management?
Well, human error and confirmation bias absolutely play a role in any high-stakes conversation. When a player's entire identity and livelihood are wrapped up in wearing that black jersey, they're psychologically primed to latch onto any positive reinforcement.
Makes total sense.
However, the initial crossed wires aren't really the systemic red flag here. The critical failure is the total lack of follow-up communication after the squad was named.
The absolute silence after the final decision is locked in.
Precisely. I mean, even if a head coach genuinely believes they were clear about a medical contingency, the moment the final decision is made to drop a 36-test veteran who has captained a Super Rugby franchise, a direct phone call is the bare minimum professional standard.
Yeah, you have to make that call.
But what becomes glaringly obvious from the reporting is that this avoidance was a pervasive managerial blind spot. Assistant coaches were reportedly being left to do the dirty work. They were the ones forced to explain omissions to players who had been left completely in the dark by the head coach. And that cowardice elevates this from a simple misunderstanding to a massive structural failure in leadership accountability. Delegating bad news just destroys the hierarchy of respect.
And it is that exact refusal to untangle those cross wires that leads directly to an incredible ultimatum. Papali'i gets snubbed for Argentina, gets no phone call to explain why, and decides he has finally had enough. He instructs his agent to invoke a specific clause in his contract, allowing him to quit early if he isn't selected by the All Blacks.
And we really need to contextualize how massive that mechanism is.
Yeah, explain that.
So New Zealand Rugby utilizes a highly centralized contracting system.
Yeah.
Unlike football or American sports, where you contract solely with a localized club, in New Zealand, the national body holds the ultimate purse strings.
Right, it all rolls up to the top.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These exit clauses exist as a pressure release valve for top-tier talent, allowing them to seek lucrative contracts overseas if they naturally fall out of the national picture.
Sure.
But for a player in his absolute prime, who was just months prior considered the bedrock of the forward pack, to proactively trigger this clause, that is a drastic, definitive escalation.
And the timeline just goes into overdrive from here. Because after invoking that exit clause, he actually gets picked for a team, but not by Robertson.
Right.
He's selected by Jamie Joseph to play for the All Blacks XV, which is essentially the reserve national team. And he absolutely thrives.
He was brilliant.
He goes out and successfully captains the team against Uruguay and the Barbarians. He proves his leadership, his physical fitness, his undeniable value on the pitch. And then, here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Scott Robertson subsequently calls him up for the final test against Wales. The head coach finally comes back knocking.
After all that.
And Papali'i rejects the call-up. He looks at the ultimate prize in New Zealand sports, says, no, give the opportunity to someone else, and commits to joining his former teammate Jack Goodhue at the French club Castres.
Wow.
I mean, it takes an unbelievable amount of leverage and personal conviction to reject an All Blacks call-up. Historically, for a Kiwi player, turning your back on the black jersey when it's actively offered to you is universally seen as the definitive end to your international career.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you really feel the profound sadness of the situation. That word needlessness just echoes so loudly here.
It really does.
We are talking about a player who is universally described by his peers and highly well-liked and respected. When a player of that caliber, with that kind of deep, stabilizing locker room presence, actively chooses the south of France over the All Blacks jersey, it sends shockwaves through the entire ecosystem.
I can imagine.
His fellow players viewed his decision as a seminal moment. It wasn't just, a career move for financial gain. It was a glaring emblem of the sheer confusion and frustration reigning within the camp.
It is a colossal statement of intent, and I actually want to throw this over to you listening right now. What are your thoughts on Papali'i's decision? Drop a comment below and let us know.
Yeah, I'd love to hear this.
If you were in his boots after being ghosted and having your professional trust completely broken, would you have rejected that final call-up to play against Wales? Or would the historical lure of the jersey be too strong to ignore, regardless of the management? Let us know what you think.
It's a tough call.
It is. Because his decision didn't just affect his own trajectory. Papali'i essentially became the totem for a massive collective grievance across the squad.
He absolutely did. Zooming out from his individual narrative, we see these systemic ripple effects. During a thorough review of the 2025 season, where 25 different players were interviewed, Papali'i's situation was repeatedly brought up.
25 players, wow.
Yeah, he became the cause célèbre among his teammates. His treatment essentially validated everyone else's lingering frustrations regarding the lack of clear, honest communication from the top down.
And it escalated to the point where the head coach of the Blues, Vern Cotter, actually had to intervene.
That's right.
A Super Rugby coach having to contact the All Blacks head coach directly on behalf of his own frustrated players. For those who might not know the intricate hierarchical politics of New Zealand rugby, that is practically unheard of. The All Blacks are the apex predators of this sporting ecosystem. Super Rugby franchises exist almost entirely to serve, develop, and feed talent to the national team. So for a franchise coach to break protocol, step out of line, and call out the national coach about player welfare, that means the internal mechanisms were completely broken.
That intervention is an extraordinary detail from the reporting. It bridges the gap between, a few disgruntled players complaining in the background and a genuine, undeniable operational crisis.
Right.
Vern Cotter is a hard-nosed, uncompromising veteran coach. He does not make that phone call unless the psychological toll on his players is directly impacting their ability to function on a day-to-day basis.
Which is terrifying for a national program.
Exactly. And of course, this all feeds into the broader, frankly, shocking context of Scott Robertson's eventual sacking.
The fallout is immense. You have Greg Barclay, an NZR executive, going on public record calling the sacking a very good outcome and the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But then from the outside, you have former Wallabies and England coach Eddie Jones chiming in, and he's blasting New Zealand rugby as being, quote, weak as water, heavily criticizing how player power dictates these outcomes.
It's a polarized debate.
Totally. And adding insult to injury, former player Justin Marshall claimed Robertson wasn't even given a heads up on the day he was axed, which is an ironically poor piece of communication to end a tenure plagued by poor communication.
The irony is rich.
Right. And now Robertson is set to face off against Raz Erasmus in his next coaching job. So what does this all mean? How does one player's specific grievance become the lightning rod that seemingly brings down an entire coaching regime?
Well, it demonstrates that in elite sporting environments, high-performance culture is incredibly fragile. And we are really seeing a collision of generational shifts in management expectations.
How so?
To look at this neutrally, Eddie Jones represents a highly traditional, old-school management view. He's arguing that player power is run amok and modern athletes are demanding constant validation that a national board shouldn't bow to.
Okay, that's one side.
But balancing that perspective, the intervention of a coach like Vern Cotter strongly suggests this wasn't merely a case of modern player entitlement. It points to a genuine structural communication void.
Yeah.
When the gap between the head coach's public persona and private management grows that wide, the board, as Greg Barclay noted, often feels they have no choice but to essentially amputate the leadership to save the health of the broader organization.
The warning signs were all there, from the confusing press conferences to the silent squad announcements. But the failure to address them head-on sealed the fate of the regime.
And this raises an important question, which actually brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today.
Let's hear it.
There's a fascinating observation from Mike Blair in the sources. He was talking about the fortunate luxury the All Blacks have compared to coaching a team like Scotland.
Okay.
The All Blacks have an absolute overwhelming abundance of generational talent. But does that extreme depth actually make man management fundamentally more difficult?
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about it. When the physical and technical margins between the absolute best player in the country and the fourth best player are virtually indistinguishable, perhaps clear, honest, and empathetic communication becomes the only real differentiator a coach has left.
Wow.
If you fail at that one non-athletic metric, you don't just lose a brilliant flanker to France, you lose the trust of the entire locker room.
That is an incredible concept to mull over, an abundance of talent actually making the human element infinitely more critical.
Exactly.
When everyone on the pitch is a world-class athlete, how you treat them off the pitch is the only thing that separates a dynasty from a disaster.
Spot on.
Thank you to everyone for joining us as we unpacked this incredible intersection of sports, culture, and management. Don't forget to subscribe to Rugby Obsession to catch all our future deep dives. Thank you for listening to the Rugby Obsession Deep Dive, and we'll look forward to you listening to our next episode.